Good morning, everyone. Hello. Happy Easter. Very glad to see you all this morning. I missed you the last 3 weeks. I think it was near daily somebody either stopped me or wrote an email saying, I missed Bible study, which I love. And so glad to be back with you all. This is the last of the 4 weeks of the rest of this year. So we've got the 4 Wednesdays of April, and then we're done for the year. And so it's about time for us to begin to discuss what we will study next year. And so as a reminder, if those of you may be new or something this year, that we had a 3-year series that we have just been finishing this year. So we did Moses, then David, and then Jesus. So these last 3 years have kind of been part 1, 2, and 3 of one big idea around the prophet, priest, and king identity that Jesus lives into. And so for us, we're kind of finishing this 3-year cycle. And it all began because 3 years ago, most people said they wanted to do another gospel. And so we said, okay, we do gospel, we've got to do Moses and David first in order to get to Jesus and really understand what he represents theologically. So now that we've done that, what do you want to do next? And so let me know. Send an email to Bov or grab us after the study, or if you're watching online, make a comment in the little comment section. But over these next couple weeks, let's collect some opinions about what we can do next year. And so hopefully by the end of this month, we'll have an idea of what we're going to be doing next September. Sound good? Okay. Be thinking. Someone said to me the other day, well, I don't know enough to know what I want to do. And so, which I think that might be true. That might be true. But think about what it is that you, like questions that you've had, or when you hear things read in church, is there a particular kind of reading that seems most interesting or might be most confusing or perhaps most intriguing? I mean, something, I don't really want to, I won't tell you what I do or do not want to do. We've never done prophets, for example. We've done some history. We've done 2 gospels. We've done 2 other books. Well, actually, we did a summer session where we did a couple epistles. But we've done 2 other books. We've done Acts and Revelation in the New Testament. And so epistles, we really haven't done much of those. Prophets, we really haven't done much of those. And so those are some of the ideas. But we've also, when it comes to history, there's a good amount of history that we haven't done either. We haven't done any of the sort of smaller Old Testament books, things like Ruth and Esther and that sort of stuff. So there are a lot that we haven't done, plenty for many, many more years for us to do very, very interesting things. And so be thinking about stuff you don't know. And if I just said something and you don't even know what I'm talking about, you're like, the prophets? Or like, who's Ruth? That sort of thing. Like, let me know, because those are some really good ones that we could do. And many of them aren't big enough perhaps for a whole year on just that, but we can build a year where we might do 2 or 3 things together. We've got like Joshua, Judges, Ruth. They're often studied together. That kind of thing we might do in a single year. So put your thinking hats on, say your prayers, let me know what you're thinking, and we'll figure it out hopefully by the end of this month. And if not, then I'll leave you in suspense all summer. Okay. Reminder that we love questions. Ask away. If you're live, put them in the chat. Bov is monitoring the chats. And send emails if you listen throughout the week, and we will collect those questions. We have one from a few weeks ago that I wanted to touch on here because it's not one that I can fully answer, but it's one I want us to continue to consider, and that is the idea of heaven. So we had someone who wrote in a nice long kind of thought process around heaven, and they understand not considering heaven as a physical place in the sky. That makes sense. But then what is it? Is it something that we hold in our hearts? They kind of thought through with, I think, a series of 6 or 8 different questions as they were going through. Things like, do I hold the spirit of people that have loved me, that I have loved, who have died? and then pass that spirit on, that kind of love I receive that I pass on to others as love, is that sort of the heaven that Jesus is talking about? Is there actually something that is coming in the future, and on and on and on? So, as I said, there's no real answer because we don't know, but there is this sense that Jesus speaks of heaven more about something that we can do now rather than something that is promised. He does both. And so I don't want you to misunderstand the theology of heaven as this promise for the future that is absolutely biblical. There are sections where Jesus speaks of heaven as something promised, or heaven as something that will be coming in the future. More often, Jesus speaks of heaven as something that we actually realize right now. Like our actions, when we love God, love our neighbor as ourselves, that is actually what's bringing heaven now. And so heaven typically, especially for Jesus, is posed as the alternate reality to the world that we experience. So that alternate reality can certainly be something that's coming in the future. But that alternate reality is also something that we can realize in some way right now during this life. So it is kind of a both and. And what I want us to make sure that we don't do is make the mistake of heaven as some reward that we get for being good. That's the easy human thing to do, is to say, if I do good most of the time, or if I say the right words in the right way at the right time, then somehow I'll get the prize of heaven after I die. Because that then puts us on a path of thinking that heaven is not here, cannot be, and then that naturally means it matters much less what we are doing right now than what we do in order to earn heaven later. And then that allows us to de-emphasize the way that we operate and behave in this life, like right now. That's a problem, because for a follower of Jesus, how we actually behave and the choices we make right now matter immensely. And if heaven becomes the ultimate reward and heaven is something after death, then it kind of doesn't really matter what we do right now every day to day. It only matters kind of what we do perhaps by the time we die. And that can become problematic when it comes to behavior and the way that we treat people in the world right now. That's all I'll say right now, unless you've got a follow-up question. Maybe? Okay, then it sounds like we need a prayer, and then we'll get started with John chapter 18. Let's pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the gift of the resurrection, the gift of defeating death so that we no longer have anything to fear in this life. May we take that courage and help change the way we live today and tomorrow and for the rest of our lives. In our time today, open up our hearts and minds that we can make space for your Spirit to fill us up and be transformed. That this great 50 days of Easter will help us to become more and more the people that you made us to be. I ask your presence with all those we hold in the silence of our hearts and minds, especially those who are sick and those who are nearing the end of their lives. May our prayers in your presence lift them up. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, gang, we are in chapter 18 of John's Gospel, and we've got 3 sections today. Section 1, Jesus' arrest. Section 2, Peter's denial. And section 3, Jesus' trial, part 1, because it goes on into chapter 19. So let's start with Jesus' arrest. We know that John, the gospel writer, is creating a very systematic arc of a story. We know that the first half of John pointed to the signs. The second half of John is really speaking about Jesus in the theological sense. John is also connecting dots all the way through his gospel to all the stuff that came after. And for John, Jesus is the new promise, the new covenant, and even so far as the new creation. Like he is recreating the world as he does his ministry. And we see a glimpse of that here in the way that John tells the story of Jesus' arrest. The scene in John's gospel of Jesus in the garden is very different than Jesus in the garden in the synoptic gospels. Mark, Matthew, and Luke tell a very similar story of Jesus in the garden. I like Luke's version most, and so that's the one we're going to read as an example. But the story in the garden is very passionate and it's very emotional. And when you think of Jesus in the garden, I imagine most of you think like me, the concept of Jesus in the garden is kneeling at the stone and the disciples fall asleep and Jesus is kind of weeping and he says, "Can you take this cup from me?" But then he says, "Okay, I will do it." And I mean, there's this very passionate, emotional sort of scene in the garden before his arrest. For John, that passion in the garden is almost completely absent. Mostly because for John, Jesus' wrestling with his purpose happens many chapters earlier. If you go back and look at John chapters 11, 12, and 13, that's where Jesus really wrestles with his purpose. So by the time we get to the Last Supper and then Jesus going into the garden in John, Jesus is ready. I mean, Jesus really comes forward. He's like, bring it. He's good. In Mark, Matthew, and Luke, we get a very different experience of Jesus where it's kind of the last, I don't want to postulate it this way. I often think of the way that Jesus in the garden with Mark, Matthew, and Luke is like Jesus' last attempt to maybe not have to do the trial and the crucifixion and the death. And part of what I've posed to you before is a general question: did Jesus have to die in order to fulfill his mission? I've always said, have to die? No. But did Jesus need to die by the time it got to that point? Yes. And so there's a little bit of a nuance there. I think that the Jesus I see in the Gospels up to this point has kind of been trying to fulfill his mission without all of the violent and gruesome death in the end. It would have been great. It would have been great had Jesus just shown up and started performing miracles and teaching and speaking and everyone just kind of going, yeah, this sounds great. Let's do it. Great. But that didn't happen. And so at this point, Jesus kind of accepts, yes, this is what needs to happen. And by this, I mean the death, the crucifixion needs to happen now in order to fulfill the mission. In Luke, I'm going to read from Luke chapter 22. This is the story that I think most often is depicted in art and is probably the kind of story that most of us would just tell off the top of our head. If someone were to ask you, describe Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane before his arrest, this is probably mostly the version that we would tell. So Luke chapter 22 verse 39 says, Jesus came out and he went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed. This is what he said. "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he got up from his prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." While he was still speaking, a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading. He approached Jesus to kiss him. And Jesus said to him, "Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man?" So that's the way Luke tells the story in the garden. And if I were to recall just the generalized story of things, we've talked about how we conflate the Gospels together to create like a three-dimensional picture. The most easy example of that is the nativity story. We take Matthew and Luke and we put them together, and there are shepherds and there are kings and everyone's there as like a big party at Jesus' birth. That's not the way either of them tell the story, but why not put them together? We do the same kind of thing through Jesus' passion. How many of you came to at least one extra Holy Week service between Palm Sunday and Easter Day? Come on, get credit if you did it. Oh, good. That's like almost all of you. Good job. The story of Jesus' passion is not one that I like. I remember as a child reading through the Passion in church, which was always on Palm Sunday and on Good Friday. We had to do both of them. Reading through the Passion, I never liked the point at which the congregation was supposed to yell, "Crucify him." I don't like it. And so as a child, I wouldn't say it. And then as an adult, I realized I think I'm supposed to say it, and I'm supposed to be uncomfortable. And it's that discomfort that I'm supposed to be reminded of in that moment. And so now, even though I don't want to, I do say it when we're in the service, because that's part of accepting the kind of imperfection of our humanity and the need we have for Jesus. That discomfort is part of a big macro story of the Passion that I think most of us can kind of recall off the top of our head. And my guess is that that story from the garden is the way we would tell that moment. Now, listen to the way John tells the story in chapter 18, beginning at verse 1. After Jesus had spoken these words, which was all the Last Supper stuff, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus replied, "I am he." That's all you get. That's the garden scene in John. There is no praying intently. There is no asking for the cup. There is no drops so thick as blood. None of that stuff happens in John, because John's done that. If you want to go back and look at chapters 11, 12, and 13, you'll see Jesus kind of going back and forth with this whole, do I have to do it this way? Maybe I can do it a different way. So by the time we get here, Jesus does the Last Supper. He washes the disciples' feet. He comes together in the garden and he's ready. But John says he's ready in a very particular way. Jesus asks, "Whom are you looking for?" They answer, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus replied, "I am he." This is not an accident for John. I am. Where do you remember that? Where? God says, "I am," multiple times, all the way through the myth stories and the histories, even right up to the burning bush with Moses. I am. That is what we get from God. Jesus then says here in the garden, "I am." And so John is trying to make this connection to the readers. All the Jewish people who heard this story, who read this gospel, would immediately see the "I am" in Jesus in this moment. And so Jesus, kind of at the very end, is claiming explicitly his purpose, his connection, his divinity in this moment is laid bare, so that people would have understood the connection all the way back to the very beginning, and to the very beginning where there was another garden. And so in the first garden, God says, "Don't do this," and humans do it anyway. And in the second garden, in Gethsemane, we're getting kind of the same story. Jesus has said, "Don't do this," and yet humanity is doing this anyway. And so just like in the first garden, where God loves in spite of humanity going against what he says, Jesus will love in spite of humanity going against what he says. So those connections are explicit for John. And so John leaves all of the drama of the praying and the crying and the blood and all the other stuff, and he basically claims Jesus' divinity. And remember what I said very first week of John. John is the highest Christology of Jesus of all the Gospels. John has the highest claiming of divinity that Jesus has in any of the Gospels, which is one of the reasons why Christians tend to like John, because this is the way Jesus behaves. Yes, it's nice to have Jesus praying and begging for the cup to leave him in the garden at different points in our life. But if we're honest, I think we kind of like the strong Jesus, the Jesus who walks in the garden and says, "Who you looking for?" "It's me." And that's it. There's a joke about the garden. I wasn't going to tell you, but I can't resist. The image, the art piece of Jesus praying at the stone. I mean, we've probably all seen that painting. There's this good joke that goes, in every Methodist clergy sacristy, there's a picture of Jesus praying in the garden. In every Catholic clergy sacristy, there's a cross with Jesus on the cross, a crucifix. And in every Episcopal clergy sacristy, there's a mirror. Oh, I love that one. That's good. All right. Okay. Any questions about Jesus here in the garden right before his arrest? We're going to pivot to Judas here in a moment. But any questions about the setup in the garden? Okay, now let's consider Judas in this moment. Let's continue reading just a little bit in John. We're going to start in John 18:5b. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again, he asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you're looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. And Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" In this moment, we get kind of the fulfillment of Judas as the betrayer of Jesus. In John's gospel, Judas has been described multiple times as being filled with evil, or the Satan or the demon or the evil coming into Judas to make him act a certain way. John tells the story of Judas very plainly that there is evil acting through Judas in order for him to betray Jesus. Why that's important is because John, all four gospels acknowledge that there's some facet of Judas that is being influenced or controlled in some way for him to do what it is that he did, to actually betray Jesus. We get the story, all three, about Judas betraying Jesus, so that's apparent. And then we get stories, multiple different stories, about Judas's death. It's most explicit in Matthew. In Matthew chapter 27, we get this scene of Judas being so distraught that Jesus is now on trial and going to be killed, that he throws the coins back and he goes off and he hangs himself. In Acts, we get a moment where Peter says, I think it's Peter, who reminds everybody that Judas died in the field that he bought with the silver. So there are multiple different ways in which Judas kind of goes from this moment on, but in both stories, he dies in a field, and in both of those biblical stories, the field is called the field of blood. And so Judas's actions here really do connect in a way through all four gospels that give Judas at least a little bit of acknowledgement that he wasn't in his right mind, or he was being controlled or influenced or tempted, and whatever we want to say, that it wasn't quite just Judas doing all of this. Now we have a choice. We can speak of Judas as being possessed or controlled by evil, and when we say evil, we actually can conclude that it's the devil, or it's a demon, or something like that. And then we can personify the devil and the demon, and then we can begin to create a theology that many Christian churches have created over the centuries, which is the devil's out to get you. Okay? And you've got to fear the devil. The devil's around every corner. If you're not careful, the devil's going to grab you. There's all of this devil talk, like the devil's a physical personification of another person in a sense, and you've got the demon and the tail and the points and the thing and whatever, and they're going to get you. Or we can actually understand this story as the temptation of a human person to act against God's desires. So in the Episcopal Church, you don't get much, if any, of the devil's going to get you. That's not really what we do. We understand this story, we interpret this story as the world tempts us away from God's purposes all the time. Sometimes those temptations are small, and sometimes they're so big that it could end up being something like a Judas moment, where the temptations so overwhelm us that we work almost exactly against God's purposes. It's one thing to be like 10 degrees off, but when you're 180 degrees opposite of what God wishes, you're really in trouble. And that's essentially the way Judas is perceived here. So then what is tempting him? There's a particular way that I teach Judas, and I don't think we've done this yet in RBS. I know I've done it in other groups. Judas was one of Jesus' disciples. Yes, we know this. Judas left his whole life in order to follow Jesus. So there is good in Judas. Judas saw something about Jesus. Judas was one of the 12, and yet something went horribly wrong. So what's the horribly wrong moment? I think for us to understand the complexity of Judas, we have to acknowledge what the Messiah actually represented to a lot of Jewish people at the time, maybe all the Jewish people at the time. Messiah meant a person who was going to overthrow the oppressors. That was the point. The Messiah was going to save the people. But as human people living under the oppression of Rome and under the oppression of many other groups, the Messiah was misconstrued as someone who would save them physically from the oppressors of the world. And so they had created this entire understanding of Messiah as they're going to show up and they're going to kick Rome out. That was what they expected the Messiah to be. And so all of these people following Jesus still had that expectation. Now, Jesus worked very hard in the teachings and the miracles and the signs and all the other things to dissuade his disciples of that understanding of Messiah, to point to that alternate reality of God's heaven, of God's truth, and that Jesus would save us from the world so that we could be part of God's truth and God's reality, and that is what we call heaven. The disciples might have begun to understand that, but we get example after example of the disciples missing the point over and over and over again. And so I understand Judas to be a disciple who missed the point and missed that point completely and very badly. But I think that Judas's actions speak to Judas's genuine faith in Jesus as the Messiah, just as the Messiah he expected, not as the Messiah Jesus was. And so if you think through the strategy that Judas could have had, this is all interpretation, this is not biblical, but I like to think well of Judas, and that Judas was very committed to Jesus, and if Judas was, like a good Jew, believing Jesus was the Messiah, he was waiting for Jesus to get on with it and to overthrow Rome. And Jesus was doing nothing but walking around and talking to people and healing people and teaching people how to love one another. Now, as an aggressive person, if I put myself in the shoes of the disciples, I would have been seriously impatient. Like, that's so nice, the paralytic walked. Great. How about Rome? And then, that was so nice that you gave that sermon over there in the countryside, but how about Rome? I mean, it would have been like, oh, yes, Jesus, that was so good. How about Rome? And so I perceive Judas, and maybe it's because I probably might have been Judas, is that this sense of like, oh, do the thing that you're supposed to do. Get us out of this. Save us. And if Judas forces Jesus into a corner, then Jesus would actually have to do the thing that he was meant to do and finally overthrow Rome and kick them out and reclaim Jerusalem and reset everything the way that God had promised the Messiah would be, right? Except he completely misunderstood what Jesus was supposed to do. And so Judas finds himself having pushed Jesus in a corner. And when he expected Jesus to break out and to finally do the thing that they thought the Messiah would do, Jesus instead hands himself over for trial and torture and crucifixion and death. And Judas's despair is rooted so deeply in his belief that Jesus was the Messiah and his realization that he was so wrong that he just can't help but go on living. It's tragic. This story of Judas is not one that should be filled with blame. This story should be filled with the sadness that a person could be so wrong and trying so hard to be right. Because I think that for us, that's where we can connect. It is too easy for Judas to be a scapegoat. It is too easy for Judas to be evil in a way that we could never be. Oh, yes, we can. For us to point fingers at Judas as if we are better than that is a real failing on our part. And so do not succumb to what many, many Christian groups have done over the centuries. And that is to use Judas as the scapegoat as if we would never have done that. Because I think the more powerful way to interpret the story of Judas is for us to actually accept in full humility, we could have obviously done the same thing and made the same mistake. And that in our own lives, we do the same kind of thing and make the same kind of mistake, where we actually work completely opposite from God's purposes, and even worse, convince ourselves that we are doing exactly what God would want us to do. That's the danger. And we see that in other groups. We see that, forgive me, but you kind of see that in prosperity gospel style movements, where our faith means that we will get everything we want. By being super faithful, we obviously make a lot of money. And by being super faithful, we obviously have great health. And by being super faithful, we succeed in all of our professional endeavors and everything goes right. Because if that then becomes our theology, then whenever something goes wrong, because it will, then naturally we have done something wrong in our faith. And then what that does is that props up, especially the leaders. I mean, how many prosperity gospel preachers are going to be discovered as frauds because they embezzled money or they abused a person or they cheated on their spouse or whatever, and they could never admit to any weakness because weakness meant lack of faith. Whatever, weakness means human. And if we can accept that our humanity is so broken, then we can actually accept that Jesus came to save us. If we can't accept our brokenness, what's the point of Jesus? Okay. Questions or thoughts on that? Sorry, was that a little too preachy? Nothing? All right, we'll ponder. Okay. Section 2, yes.
I never really thought of Judas that way. I mean, that's for me at least. That's a whole new concept. You know, but yeah, he just was. That's why we pay him the big bucks.
I mean, I appreciate you saying that.
I think that's such an interesting way.
Well, so for those of you listening, the comment was never really thought of Judas that way. And I appreciate you saying that because I think that, so although I have put my spin on that idea is not mine originally. I mean, that has been worked on for a long time. And so I discovered that idea probably in my early 20s. And it made such sense to me because I didn't, for a few reasons. I love history, and so there is an issue that we can touch on over the next, really, I guess, this week and next week. John's gospel puts the blame, I'm going to say blame, and the guilt of Jesus' death squarely on the Jewish people, very differently than the synoptics. If you look at Mark, Matthew, and Luke, there is this shared responsibility for Jesus' death between Rome and the Jewish leaders. So you get this Pilate and the Jewish leaders who they're both complicit in his death, in the injustice of his death. Not in John. In John, Pilate physically washes his hands of the issue of Jesus. And so for John, the guilt of Jesus' death is completely owned by the Jewish people. telling the story that way does a few things. So first off, theologically, I don't think that's the complete way to tell the story, because Jesus' death is because of humanity's failings. So by simply saying it's a Jewish issue, then those of us who really are not Jewish, I mean, some of you may be in kind of culture or ethnicity, but for those who are not religiously or ethnically Jewish, then it's kind of like those people did that. Well, what happens when those people did that? Then you get anti-Semitism throughout the last 2,000 years. Pretty much, when there is any major anti-Semitic movement in the last 2,000 years, the leaders are somehow rooted in that anti-Semitism of John. And so you don't get, and obviously the gravest example would be the Third Reich and the Holocaust. You can't really, it's really difficult to draw a straight line between Hitler and John, but you can draw a few dots between it. And even though Hitler, by the time he was really in it and doing all the terrible stuff, had gone against Christianity and had essentially become an atheist. When he first started out, he described himself as a German Christian. He allied himself with Christians, and the cleansing that he began, and this is early, was very much rooted in this sense of, as Christians, our responsibility is to essentially right the wrong of Jesus' death. And who killed Jesus? The Jews. Okay, so this is a problem in John. And so if you came to our Good Friday service, you noticed we didn't read John's Passion. We rotate the Passion stories at St. Michael, but every fourth year when we get to John's Passion story, you will see in the bulletin, we put a disclaimer before the Passion begins that says this has been used throughout history to develop very troubling anti-Semitic ideas. So you've got that problem of John. But then you've got the problem of Judas representing the other. And we kind of went into that with the prosperity gospel. You can conclude many different things. But when Judas becomes almost not human because of the devil or whatever fills him up, we get to say, that's not us. And it's more than just that's not us because of the Jewish people. That's one problem. This is more of a global that's not us. Because unless we're possessed by the devil, we're not going to make such bad decisions. And then we let ourselves off the hook, and we don't have to be as vigilant, and we can then allow ourselves to believe much more than we should about our natural capacity. And then that leads to, we just treat Jesus like a poet or a teacher. So one of the big problems in a tradition like the Episcopal Church is Jesus just becomes a nice teacher among many nice teachers. And he said some nice things. And we'll try to do the things that Jesus did. We might even try to be like Jesus, but that's as far as we go because we have so disconnected our fallibility from who we think we are. Like we don't really have to be saved. Like we're good. We should probably act better and do a bit better than we would otherwise, and we should probably love a bit more than we should. But fundamentally, like we're good. The problem with Judas not being human is that we can begin to think we're fine, but Jesus is still nice. And so we'll tell his stories and maybe we'll try to do some stuff like Jesus did. The problem is treating Jesus like just a nice teacher misses the concept of actually being saved from what is fundamentally problematic about our human condition. And that's part of what we have to accept, is that we need to be saved. Now, let's not be super dramatic and magical in the same way that the saving might have been in other parts of Christian history. I'm talking about being saved from what is our fundamental shortcomings as humans. We can't do that on our own. That is the point of a savior. That's why you've heard me say many times, the old adage, God doesn't give you more than you can handle, is absolutely terrible theology. Like it's completely wrong. we get plenty more than we can handle. That's why we need to be saved. We can't handle it. And so the idea that we can like lift ourselves up, no, we can't. That's the whole story. No, we can't. And part of getting more deeply connected to our own fallibility is not projecting and separating ourselves even from Judas. Other thoughts? Yes.
I'm associated that they trusted Judas with the money, and there was an association that he might have been greedy.
Just thoughts on that? Yes. So the comment was that Judas was associated with money and that the money may have made Judas greedy. And so, yes, John for sure tells the story, but all the Gospels kind of at least imply that Judas was sort of the financier of the disciples. You know, he kind of kept the budget. You know, he was the treasurer of Jesus's ministry. And so I think it is easy to interpret Judas as the money became important to him, and so he would do the thing for the money. I think that's two thoughts. First, I think that's probably a little too simple because I think we see here that the way John tells the story, John doesn't tell the story this way. The way Matthew for sure tells the story, and the synoptics kind of hint at this, is that Judas really didn't care about the money. Judas was pushing Jesus into a corner, and that once he saw that Jesus wasn't going to get out of the corner, he gave the money back because it really wasn't about the money. His motivation, maybe the money was fine, and maybe kind of in the back of his mind, he's thinking, why not 30 pieces of silver? Does no harm. But that was not the prime motivator. However, I do think it's important for us, again, yoking our understanding of Judas to our own humanity, to know that it is a whole lot harder for people with means and money and assets and power and authority to follow Jesus than for people who don't have any of that. It is so much easier for people who have nothing to follow Jesus. What is there to lose? I mean, Jesus sounds great. Saving me? Sure, save me. When we have so many examples of how we save ourselves because we do it on our own, we earn, we achieve, we succeed, we save, we buy, we do all of it, then the idea of being saved is saved from what? And so typically, wealthy people can ignore Jesus very easily for a very long time until when? Till they get sick. And I cannot tell you how many times I have been in a hospital room with someone who has every power and every advantage and every capacity to do anything they want, and they still cannot get rid of the cancer. And that is finally the point at which they are humbled. And wouldn't it be so nice to just embrace the humility before that point? Because it's so sad at the end when you realize everything that you had been promised from Jesus was true, and you've got minutes or days left. How about do it now? All of us have more than we need. That is so fun. All of us have more than we need, and all of us have security, and all of us have the ability to convince ourselves that we can do it on our own. Especially, I would say, we are Texans, kind of, we're not quite as Western, perhaps, as like if we were, living on a ranch in Wyoming or something, but we have in our culture this sense of we do it on our own. And I will say that, interestingly, having lived so much of my adult life in the South, in what I would consider like the old South, I know Southern living includes Texas, but people in Alabama don't. So depending on kind of where you fall and all of that, Dallas is like kind of southern, maybe not quite. It's a little bit more western. But if you're from like the South, the difference between the two, I think, is very apparent. In the South, everyone is connected to each other. And so nobody falls without people coming to pick them up. Whereas in Dallas, with people fall, here's the difference. In the South, people fall, and then people are there to help pick you up. Everybody rises and falls together. It's like this integral connection. Whereas in Texas, people fall, and even though I think genuinely Texans want everyone to succeed, I don't think there's a jealousy or there's really a sense of lack. I mean, that's interesting, I find in Dallas, is that I think that people understand there's plenty to go around, and like your success does not mean I succeed less. Like, it's great when we succeed together, but the difference is you succeed and you fail on your own. Now, I will cheer with you when you succeed, but if you fall, you've got to get back up. Like, we don't pick you back up. That's very different. And I think that in our culture, here in particular, because it is so ingrained in us that we succeed and we fail on our own, we can then begin to misperceive our power rests in ourself. And it's only till the very end when people have this intimate experience of being disempowered. You're dying in a hospital bed and nothing in your bank account can change that. That is when people hopefully finally can accept that they themselves cannot save themselves. Now, sometimes people get mad and the anger just carries them through and they die. But oftentimes people do turn a corner at the very end. And it would be so nice if we turned that corner before that point, because life can be so much better after that. And so for those of you who have perhaps never genuinely admitted or accepted your weakness or your fallibility, an invitation to do so, because we're all weak. What else? I saw one more hand.
I did, but I saw you look at your watch. You want me to say it?
Try. Go ahead.
Talking about Jesus saving us, you mentioned it kind of at the beginning about if Jesus had come and then it was just like down the pantry and everybody was saying, great, great, and coming in and no opposition, he might not have been died on a cross. What about the I died to save your sins?
So the question of when I ask you to consider whether Jesus had to physically die to fulfill his mission, that is purely hypothetical. And so what I want us to consider with that question, I don't think it's helpful, although, I mean, whatever, do whatever you want, but I don't think it's helpful to play out an alternate reality. It didn't happen that way. But did what?
But did he have to die?
Did he have to die? When I look at, so what I'm going to say to you, for me, I would say, and by the way, this makes me a heretic, so just if anyone's keeping score. What I would say is, have to, no. Because by saying have to, we limit God's capacity. Are you really saying God could not have done this in some other way? Because I can't quite get there. I can't quite get to the point where I say, nope, God had no other option. What the heck? It's God. So to me, like, I'm not limiting God. So to say have to, no. Did Jesus, a better question might be, did Jesus think that it was almost certain this would happen? That I would say yes. Because I think that if you were playing the odds, it's 1,000,000 to 1 that it wouldn't have had to happen this way. So odds are grossly majority, like 99.9999, it was going to have to happen this way. But 100%, I can't get there, because to me, that just means God wasn't able to do something else. And I firmly stick in the place of God is God, and I never put God in too small of a box. Because I think whenever God's put in a box, we discover God's bigger than the box again and again and again. So I'm not going to do that, because I think we've proven that to be wrong every single time we've done it. And so don't do that. But I think Jesus probably expected it.
To me, the corollary is going back to what you said, the studies of Judas and whether or not he was controlled by the devil and therefore everything happened because of the devil. That then saying is God's plan's been wiped away, the devil has seized the narrative, and what happens from that point forward is the devil's doing, not God's plan.
Oh, by saying Judas was possessed, it disempowers God's plan in some way. That's interesting. That does beg the question of God's plan. And you've heard me say before, I don't really like God's plan too far in the future. So I know it's almost like doing a statistical analysis. You know, if you've got a trend line, anyone who's ever done financial analysis or anything like that, you know, when you begin to show a future trend, you can go a little bit in the future, but every single step into the future you go, the less accurate you become. And so in my mind, God's plan is kind of like maybe tomorrow, maybe like next week. But when you talk about 20 years from now, don't do it. It's too random. Too many decisions bear on God's plan. Like, I think God's desire, you will often hear me say in sermons, God's hopes. That's the phrase that I've chosen to use most of the time, because I do think God hopes. But I don't think that God has a plan in the sense of, like, remember back in the day when we did not have GPS and we actually had to say, like, how do I get from here to Colorado? And then you would print out, you turn on this street and then you turn on that street. And I mean, we had the things from, like, what was the MapQuest? Remember MapQuest? It was great. I kind of think, you know, God could plan to get from here to Sevies. Like, that's close enough. We got that. But from here to, you know, Seattle, there are too many random things that could happen. And so we just can't go too far. So we can hope to get to Seattle, but the plan, no matter how much we plan, that trip is too long and it's too far to predict every single thing that's going to happen. We just can't do it. And I think that that's kind of where God falls. So at this point, the way that I've always kind of interpreted this story is, at this point, Jesus in the garden, we're set. Like, we know over the next 3 days, that's going to happen. But 3 years ago, did Jesus know? I would say probably not like he knows now in the garden. So that's just, play with that. Let's press on. 7 minutes. Okay, here we go. Let's get at least through Peter's denial, because we can do the trial, all part 1 and 2 next week. Peter's denial. Peter's denial in all 4 Gospels really is heartbreaking, because Jesus tells Peter it's going to happen. And Peter says, with all the confidence in the world, never. I would never do this. And just like Judas can give us a glimpse of our temptation as human people, Peter, in this moment, gives us a glimpse of how powerful fear can guide our choices. And so in both ways, Judas and Peter, we're given glimpses of the failure of our humanity and the need for God's salvation. I mean, that's really what these two do for us in this story. So Peter, as we know, the leader, the first among equals, the rock on which you will build the church, all the things. If anybody is supposed to be able to resist the fear of Rome and the high priests and the trial and all the death and everything, it should be Peter. After everything he has seen Jesus do, why is he still afraid? And yet Jesus is arrested and Peter is outside warming himself, and someone says, "Hey, aren't you one of his followers?" And in that moment, Peter had the choice to be courageous and to say, "Yes, I am one of his." And yet he says no. And then he denies Jesus 2 more times. And after the third denial, the cock crows, and Peter has this moment where he realizes, I did the thing Jesus said I would do, and I knew I wasn't going to do it. And I did it anyway. It was like he was almost out of body in this moment. The fear was so captivating of his entire self that it was like he wasn't even driving the bus. And it was only after the cock crows and he hears it that it's like he wakes up out of this fever dream and he realizes just what he did wrong. Now, in the Synoptics, we have Peter weeping bitterly and running off. John doesn't have that, which again just lowers the drama for John. John keeps things a bit more clean and theological. Let's just look real quickly at the end. If you look at verse 25, chapter 18, verse 25, Peter has already denied knowing Jesus once. And what is interesting, and we'll talk about this next week, John writes this section of the story very intentionally, where you're going back and forth between Jesus in front of the high priests and Peter out in the garden. And the comparison here seems quite apparent to me. Jesus, arrested in front of the high priests, tells the truth. Peter, free, outside warming himself by the fire, tells the lies. And so you've got back and forth, Jesus being the truth teller, Peter being the liar. And so at the very end, you've got verse 25, where it says, "Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They asked him, 'You are not also one of his disciples, are you?' He denied it and said, 'I am not.'" That's second. One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" And again, Peter denied it the third time, and at that moment, the cock crowed. That's it. That's the end of Peter in John's gospel around the denial. Peter does come back, and there's lots more of Peter at the very end of John, but in this moment, John tells the story of Peter very cleanly. Boom, boom, he's done. He did the thing Jesus said he would do, that he denied he would do, and then cock crowed and he realized what had happened. How human. How human for us who we know what we're going to do. We are so very certain we're going to make that good choice. And then when it finally becomes time to make the choice, the pressure, the fear gets to us and we choose the wrong thing. And oftentimes, we make that wrong choice. We don't actually know we're making the choice. It's not super conscious. We don't get to the point we say, well, you know what, I thought I would do that, but now I'm going to do the wrong thing. It's not like that. We just kind of do the wrong thing. It's like we're compelled to, because the fear is so strong in us. Just like Peter, we can find that we have done a or many wrong things. But just like Peter, there's always reconciliation. And one of my very, very favorite parts of the whole gospel is found in Mark at the very end of his gospel. And it's verse 7 of the final chapter of Mark. We just heard it read at Easter, where we have Mark's gospel. The women come to the tomb is empty. They see the man, maybe an angel, who says, "He's gone ahead of you. He's no longer here. The tomb is empty." And then in verse 7, the man, the angel, says to the women, "But go tell his disciples and Peter that he has gone ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you." Why the "and Peter"? Couldn't it just include Peter? Like, go tell all the disciples. But for Mark, it was very important to say, go tell the disciples and Peter. Why? Because Peter was the first. He was the rock. And it was Peter who denied even knowing Jesus at his time of trial. And so when the tomb is empty and the resurrection is declared, the angel says, go tell the disciples and Peter. And in that little verse, we see every promise of reconciliation and redemption. Because even Peter gets redeemed. Even Peter, who should have been the very first, most courageous person, who ended up being the weakest and most fearful, even Peter, after having done that, can be redeemed through the resurrection. Everybody's in. And that should give us all comfort, because no matter what we do, we're probably not ever doing anything as bad as Judas and Peter. But it doesn't mean we couldn't. And so the redemption and the promise of the salvation that Jesus brings is for everyone. That includes Peter, that includes Judas, that includes you, that includes me. Everyone's in. And I think that's a good place to stop. Let me know what you think about what we can study next year as we begin to collect, and I'll see you next week.